Good evening, and welcome to the South Carolina Virtual Campout. My name is Ranger Leah. I'm a park ranger at Kings Mountain Military Park, and I am so excited to host you guys right here in my backyard. My dogwood tree here is starting to leaf out. I've got some lovely camellia bushes behind me here, so it's a lovely setting to be able to spend an evening outside. We are excited to collaborate with the other national parks in South Carolina, along with the National Forest in South Carolina and the South Carolina State Parks to bring you this virtual campout. A few safety considerations to remember as you guys are getting ready to either camp out in your backyards with us or watch us from your living room. First of all, if you are planning on camping outside in your backyard, please make sure that you can practice adequate social distancing and that you're following all your local or county or state regulations that are in place now. Number two, only camp outside if you have the proper gear to safely do so. So having a tent, sleeping bags, a flashlight, safety equipment that's needed. Number three, when you're setting up camp either inside or outside, keep an eye out for those hazards that might be around you. If you're outside, watch for tripping hazards or any broken branches or limbs overhead that might fall if a wind picks up. Whether you camp inside or outside, don't use devices to heat your tent that could cause fire or electrocution or other injuries. Things like electric heaters or gas lanterns or candles, anything like that, keep it outside of your tent. Number five, remember there is a statewide burn ban in South Carolina right now. The South Carolina Forestry Commission has issued a burn ban out of consideration for those battling COVID-19. So please do not have any real campfires at this time. You can have lanterns like I've got here. You can also use the YouTube Fireplace app is another nice way to have some ambiance if you're either outside or inside your living room. And finally, just as you would in a park, please practice leave no trace principles both during and after your camp out. Now we turn to tonight's program, which I am so happy to be able to bring you. It's called Under Cover of Darkness, Nighttime Revolutionary Deeds, where I will tell some stories by our lantern light here of some of the American Revolution's most daring actions that happened at night. But I have a question for you at home. When you think of night, what words come to mind? When I thought about this, I thought of words like dark, unseen, uncertain, unknown, secrets, scary. Our revolutionary counterparts back during colonial times probably had the same words come to mind when they thought of darkness or nighttime. On a bigger scale though, when you think about the primitive world that they faced, images like dark forests, wild animals like wolves that are lurking in the shadows. But at the same time, these words also afforded an opportunity for daring action. Those words like uncertain and secrets and unknown, that is a moment for action in the darkness as well. And I'm going to tell you some of those stories tonight. You'll probably be familiar with a lot of them, but some you may not. Some may surprise you. The first story of daring action at night that we are going to tell tonight is one that we're probably familiar with. It was one of the first actions even before the Revolutionary War officially broke out. Any guesses there at home? If you were thinking the midnight ride of Paul Revere, you are correct. Now, this midnight ride was immortalized in the words of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, and I will read the first and last stanza from that poem for y'all. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm. A cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. Now, Longfellow took some liberties with the story of the midnight ride of Paul Revere, so let's relate the entire story. Paul Revere was employed as an express rider in 1774 and into 1775, that spring, for the Massachusetts Committee of Safety and also for the Boston Committee of Correspondence. So it was his job to take messages, correspondence, news, and copies of important documents all around New England, places as far as New York City and Philadelphia. On the evening of April 18, 1775, Revere was summoned by Dr. Joseph Warren, who gave him the task of carrying important news to Lexington, Massachusetts, just on the northwest side of Boston, that British regular troops were going to be marching that way. Warren believed that they were going to try to capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were staying at a house in Lexington, and that they were also going to try to seize military stores that had been placed in Concord, things like ammunition and gunpowder and cannon. Now, Warren was incorrect about the British desiring to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, but he was right about British intentions to seize military arms that were stored there at Concord. So once Paul Revere is given this task, he makes contact with an unidentified friend. And most historians believe that that friend was the sexton of Christ Church there on Boston's North End, what's today known as the Old North Church. And he told his unidentified friend to place 2 lanterns in the bell tower there at Christ Church. The 2 lanterns signaled to those Sons of Liberty around Boston that the British were planning to journey out to the northwest end of, or out to the northwest countryside outside of Boston by sea. That they were going to row across the Charles River into Cambridge to march to Lexington and Concord. Once Revere relays that message, he goes back home, gets his coat, gets his boots, and a couple of friends row him under the cover of darkness across the Charles River to Charlestown. They actually have to slip past a British warship in the night. And once he gets to Charlestown, he makes contact with the Sons of Liberty there, and a man named John Lawson lends him his horse. So Paul Revere mounts up, and he starts his ride around 11 o'clock on the night of April 18th. He is warned by some members of the Committee of Safety there in Charlestown that there are British officers that are out on patrol that will capture him if they are given the chance, so he has to be careful. He is very nearly captured right outside of Charlestown there in Boston, so he actually changes his route, and he ends up going through Medford, where he alarms the captain of the local militia, alarms most of the houses there in Medford before he makes his way through Monotony, which is now Arlington, Massachusetts, and he arrives in Lexington somewhere around midnight. When he gets to Lexington and he gets to the house where John Hancock and Samuel Adams are staying, the sergeant that's there keeping watch over the house tells Revere to keep the noise down, to be quiet. And Paul Revere supposedly responds, "Noise? You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars are coming out." And even at this point, Revere has trouble gaining access to the house, but he's raising such a ruckus that John Hancock hears him and tells Revere at this point, "Come in, Revere, we're not afraid of you." and so he's allowed to come in the house and deliver his message. At about midnight, William Dawes also arrives in Lexington bearing the same message as Revere. So the two men decide that after refreshing themselves, grabbing something to eat and something to drink, they're going to keep on journeying to Concord to make sure that the military arms have been dispersed and hidden so that the British won't be able to find them. Along the road to Concord, they encounter Dr. Samuel Prescott, who they determine is another member of the Sons of Liberty. And together the three men continue the journey towards Concord. But all three encounter a British patrol. Prescott and Dawes manage to get away, but Revere is actually captured. He is questioned for a time, held for a time, and then the British patrol does eventually let him go, but not before confiscating his horse to replace a tired mount of a British sergeant. So Revere is left there in the middle of the road. He starts walking back toward Lexington, and he's just in time to see the latter parts of the Battle of Lexington Green, the first shots in the American Revolutionary War. So that's probably one of the more famous night actions of the American Revolution. But another action that maybe is not as well known that also took place in Boston happened about a year after the battles of Lexington and Concord. After Lexington and Concord, New England militia pour in to the communities outside of Boston and basically end up pinning the British in at Boston, where the only way that they're receiving resupplies and reinforcements is by sea. Their land route has been cut off. These militia continue to pour in until the Continental Congress establishes the Continental Army under George Washington, and George Washington comes in, takes over these militia, and establishes the Continental Army outside of Boston, and they lay siege to the British. Now, after the Battle of Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill, where the British try to basically break out of Boston, and they're not successful, they take pretty heavy casualties, the siege settles into an uneasy stalemate. Not a lot of action after the Battle of Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill. In November of 1775, George Washington dispatches a 25-year-old young man named Henry Knox. He was a former bookseller turned artillery strategist. He sends Henry Knox to retrieve the guns that from Fort Ticonderoga up in upstate New York that has fallen to Patriot militia. There are heavy pieces of artillery there that Washington needs. He thinks he will be able to break the stalemate in the siege with those heavy guns at Ticonderoga. So Henry Knox takes engineers and troops and goes up to Ticonderoga, and in a astounding feat of engineering manages to move almost 60 tons of artillery on sledges across a frozen Hudson River and Connecticut River, and ends up bringing those guns into Boston right at the end of January 1776. Now, those guns are placed in fortifications around the city where the British are, and on March 2nd, Henry Knox starts unleashing that firepower onto the British in the city. Now, it wasn't meant to actually destroy the British Army or really accomplish anything huge militarily. It was meant to be a distraction because Washington has come up with another plan for these guns from Ticonderoga. He has decided that he is going to try to occupy Dorchester Heights, which sits above Boston where you can look down on the city. It would be the perfect place to place artillery pieces in order to gain the upper hand in the siege. So there's an artillery bombardment from March 2nd until the night of March 4th where there's more guns involved, more shots fired. The British are firing back, and on the night of March 4th, Continental soldiers and militia, under the cover of that artillery bombardment, start moving onto Dorchester Heights. with other artillery pieces and with fortifications that they have assembled out of sight of the British and are bringing to place on Dorchester Heights. So they've assembled fascines, which are basically bundles of sticks to serve as fortifications along with heavy timber. They bring it to Dorchester Heights and they place it there on the night of March 4th along with thousands of troops to occupy Dorchester Heights. And when the British wake up the next morning, the morning of March 5th, they see the guns of Ticonderoga staring them down from Dorchester Heights. And these guns brought firepower that the Continental Army just didn't have before. When General William Howe, who was commanding the British in Boston, saw this, he is reported to have said, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than my army could do in 3 months." So even he was impressed with what the Continental Army had been able to do. And he pretty quickly realizes that the British need to take out those fortifications. They plan an attack for later on in March, but a snowstorm comes in and they are not able to attack. And so on March 17th, 1776, the British Army has to evacuate Boston. They are forced to go up to Canada to rest and refit, and the British government has to rethink their approach to this fight with the American colonies. And it's all because of that night action that took place where the Americans placed the guns at Dorchester Heights. A third nighttime action during the Revolutionary War that we're probably familiar with is Washington's crossing of the Delaware River. On Christmas night, December 25th, 1776, he crosses a frozen Delaware River from Pennsylvania to New Jersey in order to attack the Hessian troops that are quartered at Trenton. So on December 25th, the day December 25th, he orders that his army receive 3 days of rations, fresh flints in their muskets, and that they be prepared for an operation. At 4 p.m. at the evening parade, his army is issued ammunition and they're told to prepare to march for a secret mission. Now, Washington's troops march to McConkey's Ferry. And then his troops don't arrive at McConkey's Ferry to be able to go across the Delaware River until about 6 p.m. on Christmas night. The sun's already been down for an hour and a half. And now is the time where they'll have to start that perilous crossing of the river. Now, Washington has put Henry Knox in charge of logistics for figuring out how to get all of these men across, thousands of men across, 18 field pieces of artillery, and horses as well. Henry Knox does manage to get all these men across from 6 o'clock that night until 3 o'clock the next morning. All of Washington's detachment manages to cross the Delaware River. And one observer that saw all this happening said that the operation might well have failed but for the stentorian lungs of Colonel Knox. The most dangerous thing about the river at this point are the large chunks of ice that are floating. The boats that are crossing have to avoid those chunks of ice. But miraculously, only a few men fall out of the boats, and they are pretty quickly recovered. So it's a minor miracle that in this night action, the entire army, the entire detachment of Washington's army that's there with him, manages to cross the river. And the next morning, early the next morning, they launch a surprise attack on Trenton, and the Continental Army lives to fight another day. A major victory for Washington after a summer and fall of defeat after defeat. Now, all of these that we've talked about so far, all these nighttime actions have taken place in the northern part of the war. So let's talk about a few instances in the southern campaign where there were some daring deeds that happened under the cover of darkness. The first one comes from near present-day Spartanburg, South Carolina. A man named Colonel John Thomas Jr. had assumed leadership of his father's Spartan regiment, Patriot Regiment, in the summer of 1780. And he and about 60 men from his Spartan regiment are camping out at a place called Cedar Springs, right near Spartanburg, South Carolina. Now, they are in the midst of a pretty heavily Tory countryside. It's pretty heavily Tory, leans towards the British. So they have to be careful when they're gathering, because Thomas's plan is to eventually go and join up with Thomas Sumter's men to be able to fight the partisan war in the backcountry. Now, Thomas is not aware that Major Patrick Ferguson, who has been recruiting militia throughout that area, knows that he is there, and he has ordered a detachment to go and attack Thomas at Cedar Springs. It just so happens that Thomas's father is a prisoner in the British jail at 96. And when his mother, Jane Thomas, goes to visit his father, she overhears some Tory women talking about a surprise attack planned for the next night at Cedar Springs. So the next morning, Jane Thomas, Colonel Thomas Jr.'s mother, mounts a horse and rides 60 miles, hard riding, to get to Cedar Springs. She rides into her son's camp, comes out of the darkness, and warns him of the imminent attack. He and his men leave the campfires burning, but they retreat a short distance, withdraw a short distance into the surrounding woods, and they wait. And in the wee hours of the morning on July 12, 1780, 150 Tories attack the rebel camp, expecting to find the rebels in their blankets. Instead, what they find is blazing fire surrounding them. Several die and are left in the camp. The others scatter and flee. And it shows, even after the fall of Charleston, that the spirit of resistance, the rebel resistance in the backcountry, even with British patrols in the backcountry, is still alive and well. Now I want to close us out with nighttime actions with what I would think is the most famous nighttime action in the Southern campaign of the American Revolution. And that is the overnight march of the Patriot Army on October 6, 1780, to find Patrick Ferguson on top of Kings Mountain on October 7, 1780. Now, the night of October 6th, the Patriot Army that has been journeying for 2 weeks at this point arrives at the Cowpens just after sunset. Now, when they get into camp at the Cowpens, the men take a rest, and while they're resting, the commanders consult with a Patriot spy named Joseph Kerr, who has managed to infiltrate Patrick Ferguson's camp. And they learn from Joseph Kerr that Ferguson's plan is to be at Kings Mountain that evening. He's going to make camp there. So they hold a council and they decide that they are going to march immediately to find Ferguson and catch him at Kings Mountain. So they handpick horsemen. They handpick 910 horsemen from the Carolinas, Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia. And these men saddle up and start their overnight journey at 9 o'clock that evening from the Cowpens. Now it rains on and off all night. Sometimes it's a drizzle and sometimes it's a downpour. It's a very dark night. There's no moon to be seen. The journey doesn't start off auspiciously. William Campbell's Virginians actually get lost in the night. The guides that were showing them the way on the road got confused and they got separated from the main army. And so by the early hours of the morning, William Campbell's men have only traveled 5 miles. Once the main Patriot Army realizes that Campbell's men have been left behind, they send scouts out in all directions. They find the men and they quickly get back on their journey, but they realize that they've lost time. But they start again and they're determined to reach their goal. Now they cross the Broad River at the Cherokee Ford early in the morning. They've traveled 18 miles in the early morning. They've got 15 more to go. 3 miles after the Cherokee Ford, they take a brief halt, eat a quick snack. They actually harvest a cornfield and are eating the raw kernels of corn and feeding them to their mounts. The rain has worked its way up into a downpour. Cleveland and Sevier and Campbell get together with Shelby and say that they need to take a halt. They need to make a stop. Shelby at that point shows that he is the true leader of the expedition here, and I'm going to read the quote that he told his men, or told the commanders. He said, "I will not stop until night. If I follow Ferguson and toward Cornwallis's lines." There's no arguing with Shelby at that point, so the other commanders get in front of their columns and the march begins again. The men are trying to keep their rifles dry by whatever means they can come up with. Some of them actually take off their hunting shirts and wrap them around their locks to keep their rifles dry so that when the time comes, they will be able to fight. Now, they learned from a local man named Solomon Beeson that Ferguson is just 8 miles ahead. After noon, the rain stops, and they stop at another local house 5 miles past Beeson's house, and they learn from a girl that Ferguson is on top of Kings Mountain, just 3 miles away. A short distance from the mountain, the commanders discuss their battle plan, and it's a pretty simple one. They're going to surround the hill and they're going to attack. And at 3 o'clock, the battle begins. And that's after covering 33 miles from 9 o'clock in the evening before to 3 o'clock on the afternoon of October 7th. A night march through the pouring rain, through difficulty, through cold, through getting lost, to find Ferguson on top of Kings Mountain, the ultimate nighttime action of the Southern Campaign. Thank you for joining us this evening. As you can see, it's starting to get dark and the lantern light is really starting to shine. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have enjoyed the other segments of our South Carolina virtual campout. If you haven't caught everything, please check our other park and forest Facebook pages for all the programming, and you can go to the events page, SC Virtual Campout, to see the complete schedule. Thank you, and have a good evening.